So today's talk, as you all know, is So Near and Yet So Far, Ireland in Classical Antiquity, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr John O'Keefe, who is CEO of the Discovery Programme Centre for Archaeology and Innovation Ireland, to talk to us about that subject. And in particular, he's going to be talking about a project for that organisation, Late Iron Age and Roman Ireland, and going to be giving us an overview of the project and talking to us about what they've discovered and new lines of inquiry. Just to say a wee bit about John himself, as he is the Chief Executive Officer of the Discovery Programme since 2020. From 2007 to 2020, he was Principal Inspector of Historic Monuments and an Assistant Director with the Historic Environment Division. He's been an active contributor to the work of the European Archaeology Council, and from 2016 to 2020 he was a lead organiser and contributor to the Way Forward for Archaeology in Northern Ireland working group. He's lectured widely about archaeology and local history, served on multiple working groups, committees, an expert contributor on policy, practice, academic development and public participation in the historic environment. And we're absolutely thrilled to have him here talking about such a fascinating subject. So can you welcome him to the stage, please? Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much for that, and I hope that the talk lives up to the expectation now at this stage. We're just going to do a little bit of tech here about recording the talk today. And if anybody has any difficulty hearing me, if you maybe just raise your hand and wave at me, and I'll try to talk louder if I can. In terms of the talk that I'm giving today, I'm going to be talking about a project that was undertaken within the Discovery Programme from 2011 until 2015. And at the outset, I'm going to say I'm talking about other people's work today. So there was work that was conducted as a project off the Discovery Programme, but involved a lot of partnership with multiple organisations in Ireland, north and south, and further afield. So, as we sort of skip through this, quite a lot of maybe text-heavy slides here. I'm going to rattle through them, but I can pause, and if people want me to come back to ask about that, we'll do that. The only thing we need to do is set my timer to make sure that I stop at the right time. And we should have a little bit of time for some questions at the end. And I'll do my best to answer them, or if I can't answer them, I'll do my best to point you in the right direction with some answers. Okay. So, thank you all for coming today. It's a glorious day to be sitting inside. The room is nice and cool, and I know Dickie and Patsy have been getting the room ready for today, just with a bit of ventilation in it. Hopefully we'll be able to keep it cool. Just a little bit of an introduction to the Discovery Programme. This is part of our corporate speak, and then I'll move on from this quite quickly. We were established in 1991 as an all-island body, and were formed through the nomination of 16 members from institutions across the island of Ireland that are involved in archaeology. So that includes all of the universities in Ireland that have archaeology departments or archaeology degree courses, and the regulatory institutions and other research institutions north and south. Our primary role though is this. So for all of the other speakers, we do research and try to tell people about it. And that's part of what we're going to do today, is to talk about the ARI project and what we found. Now, within the Discovery Programme, the ARI project was one of a number of major research projects that were undertaken over the past 30 years. The first projects in the Discovery Programme were involved in were to do with Tara, and Tara was a primary focal point of a lot of work within the Discovery Programme, and it still is. It's seen in many instances of a preeminent site in Ireland, but it's not the only one of its kind. If we have a little bit of time later on to say a little bit more about that. One of the spurs that came from that particular project, though, is looking at the material culture of items that turned up at Tara. And included in that, through both the work of the British Israelites in the beginning of the 20th century, and then later excavations in the later 20th century, a significant collection of Roman material was recovered from Tara. And that has always posed a bit of a question about where does this fit into the narratives of history, where does it fit into the archaeological record, and how do we compare that to other places. The ARI project itself, though, was also born from those kinds of discoveries and other artifacts and remains that have turned up across the island. Some of you last year might have heard the talk by Peter Crawford about the Korean hoard, the Don Rees silver hoard. Earlier has published quite a bit on some of the material in Ireland. And there's been a long interest in Roman material that has turned up in Ireland, largely as a curiosity value as to how and why. And we touch a little bit too on some of the other themes about the Roman interaction with the Roman world. Whenever we start into the project, I have to acknowledge at the very outset Dr. Jacquiline Cahill Wilson. Jacquiline Cahill is out more. Jacquiline led up the project and she very kindly gave me access to a lot of the images we're using today. Jacquiline brought the project through on its core objectives, which were fairly broad ranging. It was to characterise the environment, settlement patterns and social structures of the both pagan and Christian in the period from around about 1 AD up to 500. But it also was to take a look backwards in time into the last few centuries BC to see how those changes occurred. That putting in context the differences that could be observed in the first few centuries AD compared to what we know about the centuries BC. A large part of the project was to reassess the interaction and the nature of the interaction between people in Ireland and people outside of Ireland. And we get, and you probably heard quite early on in the discussion, there are difficulties in terminology here about how we describe these things, and there's also difficulties about contemporary today, ideas about Rome and the Roman Empire and Ireland and Irish nation and all of these things. We'll find that coming up a couple of times in the presentation. Now, why was there such a broad scope that went with this? Well, the time period was really quite considerable. It covers, not far off 1,000 years. And 1,000 years in anybody's time period is a lot of time to be considering to get everything. So there will be aspects of the project dwelt in considerable detail on individual sites and objects, and then some of the more general themes that were observed as a result of some of the themes that have come on into more recent research. It's 10 years now since the IRI publication hit the press. If anybody would like to see it, there is a PDF copy of it on our website. It's free to access and you can usually get it at any time. It goes into a period before and a period after. A period before, when we think about Roman interaction with Britain as much as it is with Ireland, and then a period after the collapse or the withdrawal of Roman authority in Ireland in the 5th century and the changes then that happened beyond. Now, if we think about where some of these narratives come through, Romans are popular. You've got horrible histories in the rotten Romans, and you've got all sorts of films, dramas, storytelling, playwrights, all of these that sort of demonstrate the ongoing and enduring fascination with the Roman Empire. And the fascination with the Republic, and the fascination with the Etruscans and what went on before, and the legacies of what carried on afterwards. And I know with the group here today, there are many people here who know considerably more about the Romans and what they did in Ireland than I do. And there are people who know an awful lot more about what the Romans did everywhere else. Where we get into some of the sort of beginnings of our stories, we know about Julius Caesar and his first visit to Britain, and then he left it again, and left the job to Claudius to issue the order to come in to Britain for invasion in around about 43 AD. And these are fairly fixed kind of points of the story as it is so far. If you look at the BBC website, they have fantastic resources there for school children that are coming up with their GCSEs and A-levels, and for anybody else that looks up into. And they have some of these little bite-sized pieces of history. So it gives us that introduction about how Claudius set about doing the job. So he was able to do it with around about 40,000 soldiers that he was able to come and initiate the invasion and start his progress through. But in reality, that was the start of a whole series of interactions, largely military, that are documented and that are most commonly known, but not just military. And that's something that is really important within the IRI project, is that while the military interactions are important, they weren't the only thing that was happening. Within that timeline, though, there is an awful lot of things happened. And whenever we're looking at this in an Irish context, we're hit with a huge imbalance of historical documentation that helps us to tell the story. Now, just again, working from that BBC timeline of events, there's a whole slew of activities here that one could go through if you have time, certainly it's worthwhile taking a look at those. Most of them are characterised by movement of the armies, areas of conquest, areas of settlement, areas of revolt, individuals and significant historical characters that come through, more revolt, more military operations, more activity. So an awful lot of these are measured out in time about what was happening to do with the expansion and the growth of the empire. Whenever we look to our own records, though, we have a major issue. Not only do we not have this level of documented history, we have issues about identifying what was normal in Ireland before the Roman period, and therefore what was different after the Romans had expanded their area of influence into Britain and beyond. If we look at this just as an introduction to the kinds of numbers of sites that we have, and just to throw out some general statistics on the board. Across the island of Ireland, there's around about 170 to 190 recorded, or sorry, 170 to 190,000 recorded archaeological sites and monuments. Now that's a big number. It's probably less than a quarter, though, of what the overall volume of archaeological sites and monuments actually is. We know that in anything linear road schemes and large areas of development, 1 or 2 new sites of archaeological interest are identified for around every 3 or 5 hectares of land that are being developed. Now sometimes these are small finds. In other instances they're complete complexes of monuments that turn up. But even within this, if we were to look, say, at the settlement patterns and the settlement sites that are known to have been in existence there in the developed Iron Age, that period in the last few centuries BC, and those sites that are known in the first few centuries AD, there are less than 100 places that one can go to and say, that's what a regular settlement site looks like. Much more familiar to us are big developed sites like Tara, or like Navan Fort in Armagh, or Rathcrohan in Drumanagh, where there are much longer periods of occupation, but real important periods of activity in the Iron Age that have been explored before. Now, whenever we come back to those sites, though, and we start to measure them up to where things have started to change, the map on the left was an illustration of the royal sites and settlements were known by the early 1990s. So it's quite a small distribution of actual monument sites that are being investigated. By 2004, 2007, on the other hand, that number had grown massively. And the reason that had grown in such a significant proportion was to do with infrastructural development that was happening across the island at the time, and in particular the road schemes in the south. Now they throw up problems with the distribution maps, and I'm going to draw out one just as an example. This one here. That maps as much the road scheme as it does the distribution of urban settlement. So we need to be cautious about how we use those distribution maps because it reflects the activity of looking for this stuff as much as it reflects the material remains that have survived. But then if we start to layer up those resources that we know about and the things that we know about in the period, we look at the distribution of metalwork, of objects of art, of coins and so on, we start to find that there's a much greater rash of dots identified across the island. And what we start to see there is that there's much more activity that needed to be brought together to understand that, first of all, that there's a lot of activity. Secondly, what that activity involved and how those connections were being seen. And third thing, and in particular for the last of these illustrations here, is to do with the distribution of precious metals. Quite a lot of that was probably made in Ireland, but there were other items that were being brought in. So, if we think about where some of the scholarly interest has been for this and for students within the classical traditions, Haberfield, back in the beginning of the 20th century, wrote a bit of a critique, and this is in response to some of the discussions there was around about Agricola's proposed campaign in 82 AD. And I was looking at where some of this material was turning up in Ireland, what kind of material. It's a much sparser distribution map then than it is now. So we have to be very, I suppose, cautious about this whenever we're looking at how people have understood the past in the recent past. Some of this is about how people understood the past in the distant past as well. So a scholar 100 years ago was working with this kind of distribution map, which was quite small. In the time since then, there's been a lot more research has happened, and a lot of that has actually to do with the review of collections in museums and objects that might well have been known at the time. One of the things that was sort of drawn out from this kind of distribution map was it focused on certain coinage that came through and precious objects that had been found in association with some quite significant sites. and the start of some ideas about what was happening in the interaction between Ireland and the Roman world in the first few centuries BC and AD. Most of these were objects that turned up at major sites, so places like Mouth and Newgrange, a gold coin that had turned up at the Giant's Ring. Other objects that at the Multidisciplinary, on the other hand, have been identified as being largely Bronze Age and not Roman, but there are other Roman items that came from the famous burial of Ptolemy, a site which can't actually be identified in the ground, but is well known from its remains. And those suggestions started to hint at the reuse of older monuments in Ireland by people who were depositing precious objects in them, either as votive gifts or offerings. For reasons we can't now fully understand, we can start to think about why they might have done that. Had they brought these back from somewhere else, or these people who had left this island and had gone into the Roman world and come back with these precious goods and offered them up when they came home again? Or the objects were traded in and came by a process of trade and exchange that eventually ended up being recognised as being special and precious, and again were being offered as votive deposits? Or, in some instances, that somebody just simply dropped them out of their pocket and couldn't find it again? These are all problems that we had along the way. I'm going to touch just on to the activities that we know were happening certainly elsewhere in the British Isles, but if we were to look at this at the same time to say, well, what do we know about what was happening here? We're met with the large degree Ptolemy's map, drawn sometime in the 2nd century, and the documentation versions that we have of this are drawn down as cartography around 1,000 years later. So we don't have that same level of contemporary accounts of what was happening, and those accounts that we have tend to be from much later dates in time. Now, these are invaluable for research and the expansion of the Roman Empire and recognition of settlements and movement of people and so on. In Ireland, what we tend to do has been a fascination with making sure that Ptolemy got it right. And that's a problem too. We don't know if he was right in the first instance. There is a good, faithful rendition of the coordinates that was given to these sites over a long period of time. So we don't think that people were changing the 6 to a 7 or 4 to a 5 and moving places about. But this is reporting places that were familiar in Ptolemy's time that may well extend back several centuries before that. You know, we talk about population groups, significant navigation landmarks, places where there are people and access to the island, or places where there were natural resources that could be utilised. There's been a lot of ink spilled that, while not read yet, is in fact Navanfort or Tara. If the promontory of Isotope is somewhere around the western seaboard of the subcoast of Belfast. Those are important discussions because what they are doing is drawing out why we should associate either Ptolemy's map with those places or the artifacts and remains that have turned up there with the Roman period. But we're probably never going to get it entirely right. This particular map has come from a book by Darcy and Flynn, and this is where they've used the technique of Bayesian modelling to render mathematically the coordinates that Ptolemy used as a rendition of the map of the empire. And it shows out things like the concept of the world as a globe as opposed to a flat surface is one of the things that Ptolemy was concerned with communicating. But the world isn't a perfect sphere, so it's not going to have entirely the right coordinates all the time. A lot of these locations are correct relative to each other, but not necessarily relative to a centre point. So the distance, say, from Belfast to Edinburgh, we know about now, but the distance from Belfast to Rome is much harder to say. But the distance from Edinburgh to Durham to Colchester to London and so on can be worked out with a much greater degree of precision. And it's interesting to see how that now has really shown this familiarity that there was in the Roman world about the area inside the empire and the lands immediately outside. It does take us into why these kind of maps were used. And touching on the more contemporary history of Ireland, there was a reference made whenever the Ordnance Survey was being put together that said Ireland was the most troublesome part of the empire and therefore it has a great map. It needed to be mapped for different purposes and different reasons. I think that Ptolemy was very much around about trade and exchange, but it was also used for military purposes. This is one that Raoul may be able to talk about much more than I can, but it's a passage which has caused a lot of angst, excitement and debate. And whether or not the Romans either came here in a military sense, or if they thought about it, or why they didn't. And it also drifts off, and say we would more about this into other debates too. So this idea that after Agrippa had been campaigning from Anglesey and moved up north into Scotland, that for some reason either he had drifted across into Ireland, had visited Ireland, had seen Ireland, or had talked about it. But Tacitus tells us that Agricola had given consideration to having a go, and that it would be quite easy to do. In the event, it never happened, but whenever we look at where those popular understandings are, is that for some reason Rome didn't try to take Ireland on. And that becomes part of a very powerful debate, which is stemming some of the discussion about what we look at next. And this is why. It immediately flips across sometimes into the more dramatic headlines of was it boots in the ground? Were they repelled? Could the Irish not be subdued? Was this to do with the ineffectiveness of the Roman Empire or a fancy too far and all of those things? And whenever we look at where some of those studies back to Haverfield's time and coming through the early 20th century, there's a lot of things happening with the idea of what constitute nations, nation states, empires, global reach and all of that. We still see it today in different forms. And we would see this reason to identify groups as being different from somebody else. But it also throws up that question that we have too about what do we actually mean by Roman? Is it just the military? Is it its administration? Or is it by the 3rd century that most people that live within the Roman Empire be granted citizenship and therefore everybody's a Roman? So it could be any of those things. And what does it actually mean to things that happened here? So touching into that sort of timeline, sorry, just dip back for a moment. In the 58 and the 61, 62 AD, we see rebellion being suppressed in Britain. We see Agricola coming across into Britain. His campaign that goes into Wales, suppression in the Reckon of Anglesey, and then over the next number of years moving further north. And around at that time, we see things that are starting to appear in Ireland which may or may not be broadly contemporary. Some of this is associated with Ptolemy's map, where we see the names of some of those tribes turning up both in Ireland and in Britain, and one suggestion being that this is the movement of people who have been displaced through the expansion of the empire. Others now would suggest that actually these are tribal names that may have been common in many different places because of their associations with different groups. It's a hard one to really, that I've found to really get that association in, but it's if you think of it in sporting terms, lots of teams are called Dynamo, so Dynamo Kiev, Dynamo this, Dynamo the others. They are groups of people who associate with a particular idea or concept. In this context of the tribal origins, it's to do with associations with either faith communities, religions, gods, deities, or founding figures, and their names are shared across different regions. But at this particular time, and within the context of the ARI project, things were being looked at differently. And one of the ways we can do that now is with the assistance of some of the technologies to help visualise what people were looking at the time. This is a tremendous resource online outside of any classical consideration. If ever you're having an argument about which hill you can see over there, now we have the ability to generate panorama views, which will say that's definitely Slemish and that's definitely not the Armagh, and things like that we can put through. So this one, Reducely, is an online resource you can use. I've used this to model out a couple of views coming across the Irish Sea. So if we think about Agricola, he's just wrecked the place, or conquered the place, or subdued the place, depending on how one wants to phrase it, in Anglesey. And he's standing there at the seashore, looking out to sea and thinking about what next. What can he see? What can you see if I can move this? So this gives an idea of what could he see. The first thing you could see is you can see the Wicklow Hills. And there's been debate about whether or not you can actually see Ireland and Wales if they're visible. They are. If you go up high enough, you can see one to the other. Anybody who's driven the coast road, you'll see this all the time, looking across to Scotland, but it's only about 30 miles or so from the west coast to the Irish coast. So, all of those on the left-hand side of the Wicklow Hills, and into the mountains, head out towards Glendalough in that region. And one dot on the side here is Lambay Island, just outside of Dublin Bay. If we go further north, and we know there's Roman campaign forts up around Stranraer, and places where there was certainly a significant Roman military presence, and they're looking back again. Same kind of thing. They've got a whole horizon of land. It's not that they're looking out over the sea thinking we've got to the end of it, and I'm sure you've had from previous speakers, there's lots of knowledge about the island off the continent. So people knew that there was an island here, there was interaction going on all the time. It wasn't so far away. It was compared to the same kind of a distance between the English coast and the north of France. So it's not far in shipping terms at all. So the project itself was designed to look at things differently and to start to think about what are these things that can be seen. We know that people are complicated and history is complicated too. That's a bit of a get-out clause when you can't explain something, it's a bit complicated. But sometimes that becomes clear if there's more evidence. So the more information is there, hopefully one can build up a much better idea of what those interactions are. There are things that as archaeologists that we tend to identify core threads that go through. And those are things to do with architectural styles, the shapes of buildings, the places where people lived, the lifestyles that they followed, their food, their diet, and all of those things. Issues with faith and concepts of religion, practices with the treatment of the dead as well as the living. Set aside some of these things about looking at this Roman interaction in solely military terms and start to think about it in trade and exchange, movement of people, movement of ideas. And so whenever the project started off, it took two main centres. One was around about the Dublin Meath sort of area, so really from Drogheda down to, from the Boyne to the Liffey. And then the second core is around about Kilkenny, just in here, which was looking at a very significant collection of material that turned up at Freeston Hill, which had been explored in the 1930s and then in subsequent times. And the project really took this sort of what-if kind of approach where it was working across disciplines. So it's not just archaeologists going out and getting things that they're putting apart. It was looking across institutions and disciplines that knew more about this topic. And this is one of those things that's really, really important. One can look at the archaeological remains and come up with one idea, but if you've got an historical record that illuminates that further, it's much better to bring those things together. And it did build on all the research projects that have been happening. And this last item about re-looking at some of the material in museums. So I'm going to talk about one of the main scientific research themes that happened at the beginning. It was to do with isotope analysis and the chemistry of people, of living things. So, in the archaeological record, we know from some of the road schemes in the area around about Drogheda and Dundalk that there are some unusual burials. Some of these are flexed inhumations, so they're complete remains and not cremations. We don't have very many inhumation burials at all from the Iron Age in Ireland. We think that most people are being cremated and the remains are probably being dispersed. We don't really find very many sites where we can say this is definitely a cemetery. What we also struggle with though is the number of dates that have been achieved in some of these sites. So in England recently, I was reading about the discovery of new Mesolithic cremations that have been found in an excavation that were all assumed to have been Iron Age. And the reason for that was if you find a couple of hundred of these things, maybe 5 or 6 get sampled and they're dated. Not a bigger sample was maybe captured a few more of these, and whenever people go back and look at them again, they find actually there's a bit more complexity in there and there are more things to be found. And it shouldn't be surprising because the places that are available for settlement and use today are quite often the same kinds of places that have been accessible and useful for settlement for thousands of years. If you think of where most grim forts are across the island, you'll see plenty of fairy forts and thorn forts up in hilltops. Those hilltops have been hilltops, they haven't been created that way in human times. Those are also the places that one dry ground and dry land where one might quite often find Bronze Age settlement activity too. If you look at areas of dry, well-drained agricultural land that's quite often used for arable agriculture today, those areas of land also tend to coincide with where you might find Neolithic settlement, which up until about 40 years ago was virtually unknown in Ireland. Within the isotope analysis, I hope my voice isn't too quiet for you to hear though at this bit of it. Within the isotope analysis, there's a couple of things though that we can do. Just see the next one. Yeah. So isotopes are very, very good at identifying the movement of individuals who have moved now. It's not very good at identifying the children or the grandchildren of the descendants of people who have moved in the past. DNA, a much more powerful tool than that, is still very much in its infancy, and it's wholly dependent on the availability of the right kind of material to sample. Cremation destroys most of the DNA evidence that you're going to get from these sites, and being able to recognise the thing is of a certain age in the first place is half the battle. But if we take the I'm going to do something like that. Sorry, passing.
That's all right. That's all right. Just listen.
Oh, we're good, right. Oh no, that's grand. This is where we need to be now.
Sorry, I'm just going to look at that subtitles then just to see. I don't know.
Maybe we had something supposed to
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just going to make sure.
I can guarantee if these are all going to use any of the subtitles, we'll talk about even less sense than it does now. So
Sorry,
they're not really geared up to Belfast speak, I think. The isotope analysis, as I was saying, they're very, very useful for identifying people who have moved in their own lifetimes from one place to another. And it is that old adage of you are what you eat. Now, isotopes can be fixed in your dental enamel, and they don't change very much over the course of your life. So that mineralization of the teeth that happen before birth for some, but certainly in those early years of childhood, that becomes fixed, and that gives a very good indication about lots of things to do where somebody was born and had their first years. Bone, on the other hand, goes through quite a lot of changes over a lifetime. The bones that we have today are the bones we started off with by and large, but they've taken a long process of regeneration within the body. So when I cycle over into every 10, 12 years, smaller bones happen more frequently, larger bones takes a lot longer. But what they allow us to do is to look at aspects of environment, lifestyle and diet in the last years of somebody's life. So if we were to do a comparison of those things, we can tell quite a bit about whether or not somebody has moved very far. And this reflects lots of things to do with the chemistry of the soil, the chemistry of the underlying bedrock, atmospheric conditions that relate at the time, rainfall, and aspects of rainfall and the drinking water that's brought into your system. So these are location specific, although there can be general trends that will happen where you get large aspects of geology shared over big areas. So big areas of chalkland are quite hard to differentiate unless there's something locally significant that changes in the mineralogy there. These maps are always being updated. If you think about anybody who's into geology, the geological survey is a constant process because there's lots more refinement that can happen over time. And this is where some of the areas of refinement can be brought for this kind of study. And it's not just for people. We can talk about animals as well. And for this particular one, is a photograph that Jacquiline gave me. The fellow on the side here is over 6 foot tall, so this gives an idea about the tremendous hounds that you can get. The quote here that I have now is from the Canny website, and it's that reference to Quintus Aurelius talking about these fantastic dogs that have been paraded through the streets of Rome by the people that owned them. So in literature we know that people are moving about and they're showing off these. Now they're probably hunting dogs, they're being seen as a high status animal. Maybe not the size of Bran here, but you know they're different, they're unusual, they're standing out. And we know that if we look then beyond that in terms of that movement of animals and livestock, there's been some very specific projects done which have looked in detail at the isotope analysis of animal remains from Navan Fort in Armagh. And what that found was that these animals were being brought from right across the island of Ireland to Armagh. Now they weren't going there on their own. This wasn't part of a seasonal migration of pigs, goats and sheep. This was people bringing them to Navan for an event. These are events though that are, again, maybe a bit harder for us to get the full handle on today in terms of where people are moving, but it's usually referred to as a concept of feasting. As an archaeologist, I always have a bit of difficulty with that, because we're looking generally at the last meal that we found. We're not looking at a succession of multiple meals over a period of time. But the idea that people are gathering at these tribal centres, and as part of that process they're also eating a lot of food when they're there, as part of a ritual, religious, ceremonial, communal activity. It isn't a surprise. So we are starting to get a much better idea of the mobility of people in the Iron Age and Roman period in that area. And alongside the work on animal remains, there's also been the same instance of human remains. So we know, again, from this kind of analysis, that as part of the ARI project and an associated project called Mapping Death, that there are individuals who turn up on the archaeological record who weren't born here, but were certainly buried here. They were buried in a slightly different way, or sometimes a very different way from other burials that have been identified at the time. And again, the other adage that Jacquiline would use is the dead don't bury themselves. So we're talking about communities who have a familiarity with rites, customs and rituals that are playing out on the ground. Whenever we start to get into the material culture too, from an archaeological perspective, we have both the artefacts and the sites. So we're looking at the things that people had and the places where they've been. And from the 1970s, Bates had published one work in 1973, and then he followed up in 1976, which looked at a lot of this material that we found across Ireland. Now, quite a lot of the material was to do with coin hoards, which kind of dismissed as being possibly not original. A coin will give you a date for something afterwards, but it won't always accurately reflect the date in which it was made. So if you've dropped a pound coin today that was minted 10 years ago, the coin's still 10 years old, but the act of deposition is now, and the same happens every time in the past. So somebody could have brought back any of these coins at any point in time in the 2,000 years since they were minted, and that's true. We know that people were bringing back relics and tokens and all sorts of things, still do it today whenever they go and visit the Mediterranean and elsewhere. Some people like them, other people throw them out in the garden. So this is where some of these materials do turn up. But whenever the project team started to look at the material in museums and talk to the curators of the museums who are much more familiar with both the material here, people like Richard Warner, Reinhold Flynn, and Ed Kelly, and those that are working in other museums across Europe, are recognising that some of these artefacts are common. They're being found in more locations. And they go from the everyday to the perplexing. Many of you will know about Ogham as a writing script, derived from Latin script, but using a series of slashes, dots, and incisions, usually on the edge of a pillar or on the edge of a surface. These turn up primarily in Ireland, but in those areas where Roman material is also found. They're dedications which reflect in some respects the dedications you get in stelae from Britain and from elsewhere, but they're being represented in a different way of writing. But they're not just found here. The unusual shaped one there is from Silchester. They turn up, there was something in the news there earlier on, you might have seen about another small Ogham stone, portable Ogham stone, but this kind of size that turned up in somebody's garden, again in England. And that's exactly what the debate is. Does somebody take this back from Ireland, take it from somewhere else, or is it an original find? But we know that there's movement of this idea and this utilisation of language in this way. We also know it's coming the other way. Writing tablets were found up in Boyle in County Antrim, which used the Unclean script. Now they're a wee bit later, but they're very much in that tradition of the writing tablets you find in Finland, for example. And the kinds of other objects that turn up here are really quite special ones. This is the brooch that came from Newgrange. It's gold inside, gold decoration on the outside with an inlaid stone. And again, the one on the right is from Wiltshire. So they're not quite the same size, but in characteristic appearance, they are really similar. So we're looking at very good parallels of material across the regions. Now, whenever the team reviewed Bateson's catalogue, what they did find was that the deposition of some of this material, or the loss of this material, parallels were defined in other places where there aren't the same concerns about antiquarian activity or uncertainty about the loss rates, that people lose or let go of these coins quite a lot. Within the archaeological record too, these coins tend to find up without context. So you don't know if they were from a place where somebody had been buried. Some of them come from streams and from rivers, some of them come from wells, some of them come from earlier prehistoric monuments. So there are places at a monument you can make an association and say, well, this is an interaction with an ancient place. The item that's been found in the field is now devoid of the superstructure of an object or a building that could have been there. What we also found in the process was that many of these sites do need to be looked at again. I was talking there about that overall number of just under 200,000 monuments known from across the island. That doesn't include shipwrecks and it doesn't include industrial heritage for the past 200 years either. But in terms of the things that go back from around about 1700 to about 12,000 BC, that's the kind of span of sites that we have. Somewhere in the order of around about a quarter of all of those sites are identified as being ring forts or enclosures that are traditionally dated to the period from around about the 8th century up to the 10th, 11th century in terms of when they were being built. Some of them were reused later on. Of that really big number, a very small percentage have actually been excavated. And most of the times there are traces of earlier features. So I said there before the Bronze Age activity turns up on them. Whenever the application of radiocarbon dating is brought in, some of these are starting to show evidence of occupation horizons from the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries. Some of them are being identified that have small enclosed burial grounds, almost on a domestic scale, that is a settlement that is both house and grave. Others that may have started off as a house that's reused as a grave and then becomes rededicated as a place of worship and becomes a church site, becomes early to site in the longer term. So starting to throw out these kinds of questions that are coming forward. The project focused in on these areas of new geophysical surveys up around about County Meath. What I found was in these surveys, when we go back out to look at them, there's other things to look at too beyond the archaeological sites, things like the raw materials. The image here has what's called a bone ingot of copper, very, very light ones were found at Drumanagh. The picture above is of a copper mine at Drumanagh that was certainly being exploited in the post-medieval period and would have been accessible in the Roman period too. In Kilkenny, same kinds of things were starting to happen where that coincides. In this instance, not so much of the raw materials production, but some quite high status goods that are turning up in association sites that are traditionally seen as being centre points for later power centres, later tribal centres. Dancing on through from those, the project also threw up lots of other domains. So at Faughan Hill, as part of the Larry project and the Carter projects, was a reinvestigation of some of the lands up at the hill, which was reputed to be the burial site of now remained hostages. Very extensive area of geophysical survey there identified remains from much, much earlier periods, from the Bronze Age. That's what these big enclosing ditches are about. It was kind of a hill fort. But intermixed with that material are other remains which show that places like this have been used and reused again and again, right up to and including the Iron Age and the direction. Back again to that sort of view coming across from Anglesey, and I mentioned before with Lambay. This is the view of the Wicklow Hills in the photograph from Anglesey. They're apparent and they're obvious, so it's not just in the theoretical idea of where these places are. But Lambay is quite an important navigation point in that part of the Irish Sea, because you have that land mass of the Wicklow Hills. Once you get down onto the sea level itself, those horizons become shortened, but there are directions of travel can be mapped out, and Lambay being one of them. This is Lambay just to the north of Dublin Bay. And we just point out this little point here. That's the promontory of Drumanagh. So between Skerries, Lochshilly, Rush and then Lambay, there are a number of headlands there which are separated from the coast by very big banks and ditches, but are still fully part of the land. Lambay is off in the sea as it is. Looking back from that area too, one can see from Lambay, Wales. You can see parts of the lands within the Slavonia National Park and places like that. So there's a connection there going both ways. Drumanagh as a place of interest, and this is sort of starting to come towards the end of the presentation. Drumanagh was at one time marred in quite a bit of controversy. Some of you may have been at a talk nearly 30 years ago now up on University Square, and Richard Warner gave a talk about the Romans in Drumanagh. And the reason why it became a bit controversial was the site had been systematically worked by metal detectorists. Within the Republic and in Northern Ireland, the use of a metal detector to search for archaeological material without licence is illegal and can constitute a criminal offence. This had been happening for a long time, and a lot of Roman material was coming up from Drumanagh and being circulated, but outside of, I suppose, major study. It included material from Mill Creek here, but it included a lot of ordinary stuff, like things like that bone. Lochshilly in that area though has been a focal point. We know that there are a number of Roman burials, or burials that contain Roman material, and this is where we start to get into some of those nuances of language. The Roman material that turns up may, in some instances, indicate that there was a person from some other part of the Roman world was buried there, and that's what some of the isotope analysis has certainly shown. But in other instances, there are people who are from that district who have been buried with Roman material. And there's that question of how far did they subscribe to the Roman world. Now, Lochshilly, as one would see it now from that simple aerial photograph, is more or less a flat field. You can go and take a walk here. Lochshilly Beach is lovely, and there's public blues up the side of it, and this is now part of the coastal path where you can walk across. There's not an awful lot to see on the ground apart from the banks and ditches that separate the headland from the mainland. Most of the features you can see there are reckoned to be medieval in date, and they're to do with the enclosure of parcels of land there for small farms and potentially a small village, but there's no village mapped here in historical times, so it's going back quite a distance. There's a Martello Tower, which is that wee temple at the very top, and then a military road that led up to that tower, and the tower is still standing there today. And this is where it has sort of kicked off, was that this is what was going on. replete with, this was the expeditionary force potentially of Agricola, and this is where he came to, and this is where it happened. It became very fanciful very quickly, without a whole lot of evidence on the ground of what was actually happening there. More recently, Christine Baker, who's the Heritage Officer in Fingal County Council, has been leading a programme called Digging Drumanagh. And it's largely a local initiative, it's a local authority initiative in the Fingal Council area, which combines professional team and volunteers. They're excavating there just at the moment, and you'll probably see some stuff coming out on the news again about that very soon. If you get the opportunity to look online, Digging Drumanagh will take you to the website with quite a few of the interim reports. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, there aren't a lot of the illustrations of the objects that have come from this site, but I've been down and been really fortunate to get to see some of them, and they're really special. They're very clearly material that's come from the Roman world, and they're very clearly items that are everyday as much as they're extraordinary. Now, the ceramics from the site, I was just saying to John earlier on, this period of the excavation is really more in 4 shards than previous excavations altogether. When sometimes our archaeologists talk about there being loads of material, what they mean is a small shoebox that's quite full. In other instances, they might mean a whole room that's full of this material. But what they're finding here is a large number of ceramics that are dated from the 1st and into the early 2nd century AD. So it's around about the right time for when Agricola was thinking about it. But what we're not getting there so far is major evidence of military installation. There is evidence of human burial in the site from the Roman period. So it's something that is there for a duration of time. It's not just a one-off. And we don't really think that people were dying on boats and then being brought on land to be cremated and then being popped in the ground. That where people are being buried, they're being buried where they lived last. Some of the shards that we're finding are quite small, but others are fairly substantial, they're fairly beefy items. The ground has been ploughed and ploughed and ploughed since at least the medieval period, and a lot of this material has been eroded and crushed down. There are structural remains of what may be buildings. We don't know yet if those are market stalls or for other purposes, but there are buildings there. So we're looking at something that has been there for quite a period of time, probably a couple of generations worth. If you get the chance to look further online then on both the Digging Drumanagh website and also on YouTube, Christine has a few items up there now which shows some of these items that are coming up in the excavations. Towards the tail end of last year, and this is an excerpt now from the UCD website, this brought us into the very ordinary, everyday special at a place like Drumanagh. This was the first time that a fig was found in a context in Ireland. Fig seeds in one way. This is a complete fig that had slightly roasted, carbonised and survived. Little dots, as you can see on the top end of it, there are the seeds that you can have very diagnostic in the fig. Right. Christine's rendition of this is very poetical, I think. I'm not sure how far people were dipping their bread in olive oil and enjoying figs for their afternoon tea, but they were definitely eating them here. The figs didn't come along in the back of somebody's shirt. They've been brought in, they're being exchanged, they're being consumed. They're also not growing anywhere nearby, so they must be coming in from France, they must be coming in from Gaul, or even further afield. We know that they're using the vessels and ceramics that they find elsewhere. It's entirely likely, and we know that it is the case, that they were drinking wine, and that was being brought in too. We know that there was livestock and their goods going out beyond. Then you get other popular misunderstandings, and back to this, the long durée of the Roman period. This was on the BBC website. It was one that I had to say came as a bit of news to me of the period. I was talking about that interaction. It keeps on happening for quite a long time up until the Romans leave Britain. This is one that talks about the Scots having come from Spain and decided to attack the Romans in the north of Scotland. Don't think that that's true, but there's more stories there, I guess, to be unfolded. We do know that from the middle of the 4th century onwards, there were competing demands and raids starting to happen in Britain. And we know about the most famous Roman in Ireland. Here's a Britain, there was a Roman. And I suppose within those, they're also given a contemporary account of their living in a part of the world which isn't Roman. But we then have other finds, and we talked about the coin hoards before. Richard Warner has an interesting article where he talks about this stamp of X of Patrici, potentially being somehow associated with St Patrick. But we know of at least one other, and this is at Ballinine down in County Limerick, where one of the silver ingots is stamped with a key row symbol. So again, interaction of a well-dated period of time coming into the later parts of the Roman Empire in Britain. And then for another day entirely is the question of the Isotope. those mercenaries that are believed to have come from Ireland and served in regiments or served as auxiliaries to the Roman army, and who almost certainly came back again with ideas about Rome behind them. Just got a couple of reflections here and then we stop, because I have run over time. There are lots of areas here we can still be looking at. One of the big legacies that we have here is to do with the amount of published work now that exists surrounded with the Roman material. Go back to Haverhill back in 1913 and a short summary of these finds. We go to the likes of the area, which has a bibliography of over 200 sources cited in there. And it's continuing on now in terms of that new interest about the context of the world outside of the empire and the interaction with the frontier. Not just here, but in a much, much bigger picture across the world. There is more work to be done. And in summary, really what I'm saying here is that for archaeologists to recognise this material, they need to know about it. And one of the challenges I think that we have going forward is being able to recognise when glass is Roman and not a 17th century import. Of understanding that the terracotta that's been found is in fact part of an amphora and not a 19th century drainage pipe. These are very, very ordinary and possibly obvious things, but they're not directly taught as most of the undergrad courses that we have here. So I'll round up and just say thanks to Connie for the opportunity to talk here today, and to the Linen Hall Library for making use of the venue, and also to Jacqueline and to Christine for the material that they've shared with me that I'll be able to present back to you. And I would very much encourage you to take a look at that Drumanagh website. And just finally to say thank you for your time.
Thank you.